I give the floor to the representative of Colombia.
Mr. President, Colombia would like to thank Somalia in your quality as President of the Security Council for having quickly responded to our request to convene this emergency meeting, as well as thanking China and Russia for their support for holding of this meeting. And we wish you, Mr. President, a successful month managing the work of the Council at a particularly delicate time for international peace and security. I'd also like to thank Under-Secretary General for Political Affairs and Peacebuilding of the United Nations and the invited briefers. We thank them all for their briefings. This is the first time Colombia is taking the floor in the Security Council as a non-permanent member for the period 2026-2027. Colombia is taking on this responsibility with a deep sense of duty, and we are going to do this from the first day, defending international law and the purposes and principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter. International peace and security, the peaceful settlement of disputes, the prohibition of the use of force, sovereign equality, respect for the territorial integrity and political independence of all states. Colombia condemns categorically the events that occurred in the early morning of the 3rd of January in Venezuela, where we saw multiple explosions and air activity over Caracas and other areas of the country as part of a military attack carried out by the United States, which included bombings of civilian and military infrastructure, creating panic amongst the population. All of this represents clear violations of the sovereignty, political independence, and the territorial integrity of Venezuela. There is no justification whatsoever under any circumstances for the unilateral use of force to commit an act of aggression. Such actions constitute a serious violation of international law and the United Nations Charter, including the prohibition on the use or the threat of the use of force, the principle of the respect for sovereignty and the full authority of states over their territory, including their natural resources, the territorial integrity of states, and the principles of collective defense, particularly when they directly endanger the population and civilian assets. Defending these principles is not an option. Indeed, it's a common obligation that we have in order to preserve international peace and security. We need to remember that the provisions of the Charter allow for the use of force only under exceptional circumstances, in legitimate defense in the face of an armed attack, or when there is an express authorization by this Council in accordance with Chapter 7. And even in those cases, this does not amount to assuming political control of another state. In this regard, we reject any unilateral military action, any act that could worsen the situation or endanger the civilian population, and we would call for a de-escalation and non-resort to the use of force, which endangers people finding themselves in this delicate situation. They must be the absolute priority. We have learned from our experience that the civilian population is always the one that pays the highest price in armed conflict. Mr. President, Latin America and the Caribbean have proclaimed themselves to be a zone of peace, and this collective commitment and will of our region must be respected. Unilateral action that is contrary to international law endangers regional stability, increases insecurity, and worsens the already complex conditions being faced by the civilian population, with devastating effects that will transcend the sovereign borders of Venezuela to have a direct impact on countries of the region, such as Colombia. In order to act preventively, Colombia has engaged in measures to protect the civilian population and preserve the stability of the border nation with local authorities. Colombia has been and will continue to show solidarity in receiving the Venezuelan people who, given the uncertainty created by these attacks, this may lead to a massive outflow of migration, which will require significant efforts in terms of resources and capacities to provide the necessary support and assistance to those areas affected by taking in the migrants. Mr. President, these actions that we have seen remind us of the worst interference in our area in the past, in our zone of peace, and it calls to mind the commitment that we have as states to resolve our differences peacefully through dialogue and negotiation or other forms of peaceful settlement in full accordance with international law and with its instruments to which we have subscribed at the hemispheric and regional levels, such as the Charter of the Organization of American States. It's also important to understand the dimension of this situation for international peace and security beyond our region, particularly when a permanent member of the Security Council takes the decision to use force and assume control unilaterally of another sovereign state, with the aim, amongst other things, of taking its natural and strategic resources. This is very worrisome for the international community, the international order that was established after the Second World War, and flagrantly violates international law and is in clear contradiction with the United Nations Charter and the very goal for which this council was created. If a country, and particularly a country that is a permanent member of this council, disregards international law that we designed in San Francisco, what then is the role of this council, and where are the foundations for international peace and security? We are accepting that the law and the interests of the strongest prevail over multilateralism and over agreements that we have forged with dialogue and diplomacy in this very chamber. Democracy cannot be promoted or defended through violence or coercion, and it cannot be superseded either by economic interests. Democracy can only be built and sustained through respect for the will of peoples, the reaffirmation of the rule of law, through political dialogue and peaceful and inclusive processes. Venezuela deserves to live in peace, in democracy, prosperity and dignity, with a government that is defined in sovereignty by no one else than the Venezuelan people and their institutions. This is why Colombia has reiterated its call to open up paths for democracy in Venezuela through specific popular decisions being taken. The importance of preserving peace, respect for international law and the protection of life and human rights must prevail over anything else. Colombia reaffirms its conviction that working tirelessly under these principles in our new role as a non-permanent member of the Security Council is what we plan to do, and we make ourselves available, good offices available for a diplomatic way out of the current crisis in this brotherly country. We will meet our responsibility, primary responsibility, to maintain international peace and security. And given the seriousness of the events, we will continue to pay attention to this issue. And we'd also like to thank the Secretary General of the United Nations for providing his good offices to defend the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, to activate channels for mediation available to him and facilitate dialogue with the parties concerned, looking in the search for alternatives that will make it possible to find a way out of the situation led by Venezuelans themselves and provide assistance to Venezuelans that need this. In conclusion, we'd urge the parties to exercise maximum caution and restraint, to de-escalate tensions and to follow dialogue and diplomatic channels and develop mechanisms to avoid continued flagrant violations of international law. This will require the help of the United Nations and of regional organizations. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Colombia for her statement.